"Get out of first class, ma'am. We don't serve criminals up here." First Officer Richard Blake's voice sliced through the hush of Liberty Air Flight 1055, every syllable deliberate, cold, and loud enough to echo in the hearts of all seated nearby, turning curious glances into stares that burned. Without hesitation, he reached forward, snatched Renee Carter's platinum boarding pass from her fingers, tore it cleanly in two, and let the pieces drift down onto the carpet like discarded lint, as if her presence itself was a mess to sweep away. Renee Carter, seated quietly in 1A with a single black leather tote on her lap, froze, not out of fear, but in a silence forged over decades of enduring suspicion without justification, of knowing too well what it meant to be seen as an intruder in spaces she rightfully belonged. As Richard's hand dropped, lead flight attendant Emily Walsh approached, eyes sharp, smile thin, and without a word she plucked Renee's wallet from the armrest, raised it overhead like evidence at a public trial, and turned to the rest of the first-class cabin. "Let security figure out whether this thing's even real," she sneered, her voice rising just enough for the passengers behind to lean forward, drawn to the spectacle. No apology, no discretion, just the cruel ease of someone certain their bias would be backed by procedure. A woman 2 rows back, phone tilted just enough to capture the scene without attracting attention, tapped her screen. Recording had begun. Across the aisle, a businessman smirked and whispered "figures" to the woman beside him, whose tight smile seemed both complicit and rehearsed. Renee sat still, eyes focused, breath measured, her fingers resting gently on her tote, as if clutching something far heavier than leather. A history of silent humiliations, a lifetime of whispers that carried the same message she heard now: "You don't belong here." But inside she was already counting not minutes until departure, but moments until truth would turn. In precisely 45 minutes, every uniform now conspiring to disgrace her would be fired, their careers unraveling before the passengers, who would soon realize they had witnessed not a mere disruption, but a reckoning. And yet none of them saw it coming. Emily Walsh's fingers closed tightly around Renee's wallet as she spun slightly, lifting it just high enough for every passenger in rows 2 through 5 to see before delivering her next line with cruel precision. "We have a forged flyer, folks, trying to sneak her way into first class." Her voice, dripping with authority laced in contempt, sliced through the murmurs and cast a spell of quiet judgment over the cabin. The cabin's atmosphere thickened instantly as passengers exchanged glances that carried both curiosity and complicity. No one spoke, but their silence filled the space like fog, heavy and invasive. A man in seat 3C chuckled under his breath and leaned toward his neighbor, muttering, "People like that always think they can cheat the system," a phrase so casual and familiar it felt rehearsed, as if waiting for just such an opportunity. Renee's eyes did not waver, but inside her chest something colder than anger settled, a familiar chill she had known since childhood, when doubt and suspicion shadowed her presence wherever she went, regardless of how carefully she presented herself. Emily's smirk widened as she added, almost playfully but loud enough for everyone to hear, "Security will sort this out. She probably belongs in coach, or maybe somewhere else entirely." Renee kept her posture composed, hands folded gently in her lap, but her mind remained razor-sharp, already preparing the next quiet move. She was no stranger to these moments where dignity was challenged in public, only this time she would not simply endure, she would end it. Across the aisle, a young man named David King raised his phone discreetly, his thumb brushing the record button as he whispered under his breath, "Injustice on Liberty Air, right here, right now," his voice almost trembling but determined to document what no one else dared to challenge yet. Behind him, a young woman with carefully styled blonde hair arched an eyebrow, but did nothing more than smirk faintly, a gesture as sharp as any insult spoken aloud. Through it all, Renee Carter remained still, not because she lacked words, but because every second that passed brought her closer to a reckoning she had quietly orchestrated long before stepping onto this plane. David King's camera caught every angle, from the torn boarding pass scattered near Renee's polished shoes to the forced smiles Emily Walsh flashed toward passengers, a performance wrapped in thin civility but thick with malice. His phone trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the gravity of what he was witnessing. The quiet violence of humiliation dressed as policy. Renee's gaze remained steady, her expression calm, yet distant. But behind her stillness lay memories that burned hotter than any glare in that cabin. At 23, she had once boarded her first cross-country flight with a borrowed blazer, pressed slacks, and hope tucked inside her small suitcase. The upgrade to first class had cost her half a paycheck, and the suspicion she received from the crew that day cost her far more. Her innocence. That flight, so many years ago, had left an invisible scar when the flight attendant leaned down and asked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Are you sure you're in the right seat, miss?" Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as her boarding pass was scrutinized twice before an indifferent shrug finally admitted her presence was legitimate but unwelcome. Now, decades later, that old wound throbbed again, not as pain but as fuel. Renee understood with chilling clarity that this humiliation was no accident, no isolated slip of judgment, but the inevitable result of unchecked bias wrapped in uniforms and lanyards. As Richard Blake crossed his arms at the front of the cabin, his gaze cold and triumphant, he scoffed at the platinum card Renee had presented moments earlier. "Where'd you get this?" he taunted, voice rising for effect. "Amazon?" The smirk scattered throughout first class deepened as Emily casually took the card from Renee's hand, holding it aloft like a cheap prop in a courtroom farce. A ripple of laughter ran through the seats, as if permission to mock had been granted, and Renee felt the air grow heavier, but she did not break. In that precise moment, her silence was not submission. It was preparation, the final breath before the storm she had long been ready to unleash. Greg Turner, the security officer assigned to the flight, appeared from the galley with a stiff posture that masked his uncertainty, his badge clipped perfectly to his crisply ironed shirt, as if neatness could substitute for judgment. His eyes met Richard Blake's for only a moment before he moved toward Renee's seat with an authority that felt brittle. Like a script he didn't fully believe, but was determined to follow anyway. Without asking permission, Greg reached down, fingers closing firmly around Renee's forearm. Too tight, too deliberate, the grasp of someone seeking to make a point rather than maintain peace. The cabin seemed to inhale at once. The grip, that small but pointed act of physical control, shifted the atmosphere from quiet humiliation to something sharper, more dangerous. Renee lifted her gaze slowly, her voice low but clear as she said, "Remove your hand." Her tone was not a plea but a statement, a precise command delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had been underestimated all her life and learned exactly when to assert herself. Greg didn't loosen his hold immediately. He hesitated, caught between his orders and the shifting energy around him, as several passengers began whispering, their discomfort now too palpable to suppress. Across the aisle, Frank Bennett, a silver-haired ethics consultant whose eyes had narrowed with growing disgust, slammed his tray table shut, the metallic clang echoing louder than any words spoken so far. "That's enough," Frank's voice rang out, steady but forceful, cutting through the tension like a blade. You're profiling her, it's obvious to anyone watching." The weight of those words hung heavily in the air, and suddenly the silence that had shielded the crew's behavior began to splinter. But Renee remained seated, still not resisting, her composure unshaken even as Greg's grip lingered longer than it should have. Beneath her calm exterior, her thoughts were not on this single indignity, but on the legacy of every similar moment she had endured. From boardrooms to airport lounges, from polite suspicion to outright exclusion. Then, almost imperceptibly, Renee moved her free hand to her lap, sliding her phone from her tote, and with one practiced motion she unlocked the screen, tapped a name, and lifted it to her ear. "Talia," she said softly, her words nearly lost amid the murmurs. "Begin Protocol 3. The passengers around her didn't yet understand the significance of that quiet sentence, but it marked a shift. The moment when Renee Carter, calm and deliberate, began to turn the entire cabin into a stage for truth. As Greg Turner's grip hovered uncertainly on Renee's arm, passengers who had until now remained silent began shifting in their seats, their discomfort turning into something closer to courage as they exchanged glances that quietly asked the same question: how far would this go? Richard Blake stood tall at the front of the cabin, smirking, clearly savoring the moment, while Emily Walsh turned to the rest of the passengers with a syrupy smile that failed to disguise her contempt. "Sorry for the delay, folks," she said, voice rising with faux apology. "We're just handling a boarding issue, a forged platinum pass from a passenger who doesn't quite belong." The words landed like daggers, sharp and calculated. But this time, the crowd did not remain a passive audience. Frank Bennett rose fully to his feet, standing beside Renee with quiet resolve, folding his arms as he spoke directly to Emily and Richard. "You might want to double-check that accusation," he said, his tone measured but laced with warning. "Because I saw her pass, and you just tore it up without scanning it." Emily's smile faltered for the first time as whispers spread across rows 2 through 5, the atmosphere shifting from curiosity to indignation. Across the aisle, David King resumed filming, his phone angled perfectly as he narrated softly. "You're watching this happen in real time on Liberty Air. A black woman in first class being harassed, her credentials ignored, her dignity dismissed." The passengers' murmurs grew louder as Richard stepped forward, snatched Renee's platinum card from Emily's hand, glanced at it dismissively, and then, with theatrical contempt, slipped it into his uniform pocket as though disposing of a worthless trinket. "Doesn't even show up in our system," he announced, his voice louder than necessary, inviting the audience to accept his verdict as fact. At that moment, Renee lifted her phone again, her expression unchanged but her purpose now razor-sharp. "Talia," she said, her voice smooth and quiet, "log the physical contact, upgrade verbal incident status." The words themselves meant little to most around her, but the calm certainty with which she spoke suggested something far more significant was unfolding than anyone in uniform seemed to understand. Greg Turner finally stepped back, his fingers twitching as doubt crept into his posture, but Richard refused to yield. With a scornful laugh, he barked, "If she belongs in first class, let her prove it. Show us your bank app right now. Let's see if you even have the money for this seat." The insult, vulgar in its intent, hung in the air like smoke, stinging not only Renee but every witness, now beginning to realize they were no longer mere observers but participants in something larger than a single dispute. Renee did not blink. She did not rise. But her silence spoke volumes. A silence so steady it dared everyone present to consider what real power looked like when it didn't need to shout. The cabin felt frozen for a breathless moment as Richard Blake's challenge echoed, But before any further insult could follow, Renee Carter calmly stood, adjusting the sleeves of her crisp white blouse with deliberate care, as though preparing not for conflict but for resolution on her terms. Her gaze swept across the passengers, those who whispered, those who filmed, those who had quietly smirked, and then landed squarely on Richard, who still stood as though he owned the aisle. With a voice both steady and cool, she spoke just 5 words that would change everything. "Do you know who I am?" The question itself was quiet, yet it cracked the tension like lightning. Richard's smirk faltered but held, his arrogance too thick to grasp the shift. Emily Walsh glanced nervously at Greg Turner, whose shoulders sagged as hesitation replaced his earlier aggression. Renee reached into her tote, withdrew a slim black leather folder, and with the same deliberate care that had defined her every movement so far, flipped it open to reveal a shareholder's identification card, gleaming beneath the cabin lights. "My name is Renee Carter," she said clearly, her voice rising just enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Carter Global Holdings, and as of this morning, I still own 30% of Liberty Air." A hush swept over first class, heavier and more complete than any silence before it, as every passenger's gaze snapped toward her, not with suspicion now, but with dawning realization. Emily Walsh's smile collapsed entirely, her face draining of color as she took a half-step backward. Greg Turner dropped his gaze, his grip loosening on his earpiece as the full gravity of their mistake began to settle on his shoulders. But Richard Blake, ever defiant, refused to retreat. "That means nothing to me," he barked, though his voice cracked, betraying a flicker of panic beneath the bravado. Without raising her voice, Renee delivered the next blow with elegance sharper than any shout. "Effective immediately, Mr. Blake, Ms. Walsh, Mr. Turner. You are relieved of all duties, barred from further Liberty Air operations and permanently dismissed," she said, her tone as precise as a verdict read aloud in a courtroom. Passengers who moments earlier had remained silent now gasped, their disbelief turning to fascination as the woman they had watched be humiliated only minutes ago transformed before their eyes, not just a passenger, but a leader exacting swift, undeniable justice. Renee allowed the silence that followed to settle, meeting the gaze of every crew member present, before finally returning her attention to the cabin itself. "And to each of you here," she continued, her voice softening but remaining resolute, "you've just witnessed what accountability looks like. Not shouted, not begged for, but claimed." In that instant, first class no longer felt like a place of privilege. It had become a stage where dignity itself was restored, one deliberate word at a time. With Richard, Emily, and Greg now stripped of their authority and frozen in stunned silence, Renee Carter remained standing at the front of first class, her posture composed but her gaze fierce, commanding the attention not just of passengers, but of every eye and camera lens fixed upon her. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer with careful precision, her voice calm yet resonant as she addressed the entire cabin. "Liberty Air will not continue this flight without acknowledging what has transpired today," she began, her tone carrying the weight of both justice and resolve. The passengers leaned forward instinctively, as if sensing they were no longer merely on a flight but part of a moment that would ripple far beyond the fuselage. "Effective immediately," Renee continued, "I am instituting the Liberty Unity Initiative, a complete overhaul of our training, hiring, and accountability practices." She paused briefly, letting her words sink in before detailing the scope of reform. "This will include mandatory diversity and dignity training for every employee, from flight crew to executive leadership. Anonymous complaint protection with independent oversight, and biannual cultural audits across all operations, reported publicly to ensure that no passenger's dignity is ever dismissed again." Around her, the atmosphere shifted from mere curiosity to respect. Murmurs of approval began to replace whispers of judgment, and passengers nodded quietly, acknowledging not just the authority she carried, but the courage it took to wield it with grace. Even David King, whose phone continued recording every word, lowered the device slightly, his expression softening as he recognized that this was no longer just a confrontation, it was transformation in motion. Near the rear of first class, Maria Lopez, who had earlier challenged the crew to talk instead of record, now stood without hesitation and declared, "That's leadership. Not policy, but principle." Frank Bennett nodded beside her, his silver hair catching the cabin light as he added, "It's about time someone in charge showed the difference." Renee inclined her head slightly, acknowledging their words with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than applause. "This isn't a speech," she reminded them gently. "It's a promise. And Liberty Air will keep it. Every passenger deserves to be treated as an individual, worthy of respect, not suspicion." Her words settled over the cabin like a balm after a long, bruising journey, and for the first time since boarding, Renee Carter's silence no longer felt defensive. It felt like the foundation of a future being rebuilt before their very eyes. As the last echoes of Renee Carter's promise faded into the stillness of the cabin, the passengers who had moments ago been silent witnesses now became participants in a quiet, collective reckoning. Their nods, their thoughtful gazes, and the hushed but heartfelt acknowledgments weaving an unspoken solidarity among strangers who had just shared something far greater than a flight. Renee slowly lowered herself back into seat 1A, her posture unshaken, her expression composed but profoundly resolute, no longer simply a passenger, but a symbol of quiet, decisive power that did not require anger to be effective. Across the aisle, David King finally lowered his phone, his fingers hovering over the save button as he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "This isn't just a video. This is a record of what accountability can look like when dignity is defended." Near the window, Ashley Brooks, the young black journalism student whose nervous glances had earlier avoided Renee's gaze, now sat taller, her shoulders squared, her eyes shining with a new confidence that seemed to come from witnessing more than a victory. It was witnessing validation. In the weeks that followed, Liberty Air kept every promise Renee had made that day, launching the Liberty Unity initiative publicly, inviting scrutiny as a measure of sincerity, and transforming its culture not through press releases but through measurable action that would ripple far beyond the aisles of Flight 1055. And in a quiet but deeply symbolic ceremony held in Chicago less than 2 months later, Renee Carter personally awarded Ashley Brooks the inaugural Liberty Fellowship, a scholarship designed to support young professionals of color seeking careers in aviation, leadership, and ethics. When Ashley accepted the certificate from Renee's hand, she did not offer empty thanks. Instead, she met Renee's steady gaze and said, "I'm not going to write about this moment. I'm going to carry it forward and make sure it keeps happening." Those simple words carried a promise of their own, one that transcended corporate policy and press conferences, a commitment that dignity, once restored, would never again be diminished. Renee smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and adjusted her blazer as cameras flashed, not for attention, but to capture the beginning of something larger than the individual standing there. And for those watching from afar, whether they saw the video that had gone viral or heard about the reforms sweeping Liberty Air, the story was clear. Dignity is not granted by uniforms or policies, but upheld by the courage to speak quietly, act deliberately, and stand resolutely when others hesitate. So now the question turns to all of us. When we see dignity threatened in plain sight, will we remain seated or stand silently with grace? If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe dignity deserves a defender in every seat, take a moment now, like, share, and let this story travel further than any flight ever could. Because justice isn't loud, sometimes it begins with a calm voice. In seat 1A, ready to change the entire sky.